Hello. This is Allie Decker, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. Today, I'm talking to Margot Bloomstein. She's the author of Content Strategy at Work, as well as Trustworthy, her most recent book published in 2021. Margot is also principal at Appropriate Inc., a brand and content consultancy based in Boston. I invited Margot on today's episode to discuss content strategy, the umbrella under which content marketing and SEO live. We color a bit outside the lines in this episode, discussing topics like content design, building trust with content, and how organizations have a responsibility to do so in today's noisy world. I think you all will enjoy today's chat, so without further ado, here's Margot Bloomstein. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel really lucky to have you on. I know there's a ton that you've been working on over the last couple of years. And, I know you focus, like you said, a lot on content strategy, a teeny bit on content marketing, and that's okay. I'd love to just speak about your experience. You have your agency and your book and all of this awesome stuff. But before we dive in, I'd love to just have you introduce yourself, maybe give a short explainer, your elevator speech, as it will, about what you're working on today and kind of what you care about in general when it comes to content.
Sure. Sort of who is Margot Bloomstein? Right. What are we? What are we talking about with content nowadays? Well, I've been working as a content strategist in the content strategy industry for about 20 years now. So whenever folks say, oh, this is fairly new, isn't it? I'm thinking like, no, it's been the bulk of my career. That's not new. My background before that is in design. And I guess I've always kind of taken the approach. I know there are many folks in content strategy that come to it from journalism or technical communication. And I definitely appreciate those perspectives. I come to content strategy from design, and I've always taken the approach and sort of embraced the mindset that whether you're a designer or a content strategist and approaching professional communication, we're really solving very similar problems, but maybe pulling different levers to do so. So rather than helping organizations hit their communication goals through typography and color and the density of information on the page, I'm approaching it more through their choice of content types, editorial style and tone, how they envision developing content over the long term in a sustainable manner that's appropriate for their publishing culture. So that's kind of how I've always approached brand-driven content strategy. And I think over the past 20 years, I've had the opportunity to work with a really broad variety of organizations. I know in 2012, when Content Strategy at Work came out, it was addressing kind of how we approach content strategy, maybe in agency settings or within corporations that are trying to balance it with design and information architecture, broader user experience design, issues around accessibility and development. And the conversation has evolved a lot since then. And over the past few years, I've continued to focus on message architecture and producing brand sort, and really, really happy that that's been such a popular tool in our industry, but also more and more around how organizations use content, not just to build their audiences, but to kind of build up their audiences, to build up their audiences' confidence and sense of trust and ability to evaluate information and the quality of that information, their belief in their power to self-educate, and all that ladders up to trust. And I think more and more we realize that in an age where so many industries, so many organizations are destabilized by issues of cynicism, it's that focus on how we earn trust, how we cultivate trust, that helps some of the smartest organizations best serve their audiences and therefore best serve themselves too.
You had a book that came out in 2020, correct? Trustworthy?
2021, yeah, coming up
2021. Okay. So I have some questions about that later in our conversation because I really want to talk about that with you, but I'd love to start You mentioned in the beginning when we first reached out, it was under the guise of chatting about content marketing. I really appreciate how your perspective differs, because I think in our realm, which is very tiny, it's very limited, I'll admit to it. And it's very young, I'd say, or maybe I don't want to say immature. I think it's just the start of a bigger conversation, of a bigger perspective on what content is, because a lot of folks in our circle, to them, content is synonymous with SEO. And, even content is synonymous with marketing. And you're saying your experience 20 years, content's not new, right? I'd love to hear what content means to you. I know you started as a designer. So I'm assuming from that perspective, you zoomed out and you realized like design is just one aspect of communicating with customers, right? Communicating with audiences. So when you work on content strategy, like what does that mean to you? And I know that's a very broad question. It can apply to a bunch of different projects, but from the content strategy to me is a lot of SEO, blogging. I mean, again, my perspective is very limited and you have a much broader, much more seasoned one. So I'd love for you to tell our audiences, you have a content strategy project. What's that mean to you? What does that look like?
Ooh, those are no small questions there.
I can zoom in if you want me to, but I think this is a little bit.
It's exactly the conversation we should be having, because I think that some of the misconceptions around content strategy and content marketing do disservice to both disciplines. I'm a big believer that content marketing is one way that we make good on content strategy. And content strategy without execution through maybe the form of content marketing or maybe through other vehicles, without that is purely theoretical. And we're not in the business of theory. We're in the business of helping people meet their needs and helping organizations meet the needs of their audiences. And I think we can do that through content marketing that helps people self-educate. We can do that through better customer service content. We can do that through better interface content and content design that helps people better navigate interfaces and navigate information. So I think content marketing can be one aspect of how we execute on content strategy, but it's not the only thing. When I talk about content strategy with my clients or with my classes, I've been teaching at the graduate level for, I think, 6 or 7 years now. And that's kind of like one of the first questions that we always address. What is content strategy? When we talk about this thing, what is it and what is it not? And it's definitely been evolving. I think the definition that I always go back to came out of it in 2009 at the Information Architecture Summit in Memphis, I believe. They convened what they called the Content Strategy Consortium. Christina Halverson, working with Melissa Rock and several other folks, brought together, I want to say it was about maybe like 20 content strategists, folks that were working in the industry using that term. Some in agencies, some working independently, some in big corporations, some working in government as content strategists, came together to say, we're all using this term. What does it include? What does it not include? The definition that came out of that was that content strategy is planning for the creation, aggregation, and expiration, or kind of like what happens when stuff is no longer relevant, of content that is useful, usable, and appropriate to an experience. So to the user's needs within that experience, to the brand's needs and constraints within that experience, maybe to the technical needs of the platform as well, the technical constraints. And I think by addressing communication from that angle of saying, well, what are we using to communicate, whether it's on a platform or in a community or on a website or in a product, by addressing communication from that perspective, it allows us to step back and say, well, we're not putting copy out there because we all love to write and we all love to blog, so therefore we need a lot more copy in this experience. We're also not saying like, we need more like user interviews. We need more video on this website because that's what our competitors have. And we all love here making lots of videos. we're not approaching those challenges in that way. Instead, we're saying, well, what will best meet this job within the constraints that we have? What is most appropriate to the communication goals of this brand?
Mm-hmm.
And I think within content strategy, if we say that it's kind of a broad umbrella practice where there are some folks that focus more on kind of the back end of content strategy, looking at maybe more metadata driven strategy and how we model content to get it to the right people in the right places in the right context. I tend to focus more on brand driven content strategy of working with organizations to figure out, well, what are their communication goals? Who are they? Who are they not? What are the qualities they want to have maybe more associated with a competitor? And what is it that they'd like to be in the hearts and minds of their target audience? And once we figure that out, kind of in a hierarchy, that becomes their message architecture that we can use then to drive other decisions around content types that are most appropriate to meet their needs, and to meet the needs of their target audience. The platforms on which they should appear, because not all platforms and channels are right for all brands and for all audiences. Mm-hmm. And then also figuring out like what's the right editorial voice to use for those different content types. How will we sustain it over multiple content creators, and how do we sustain it over time?
Mm-hmm.
So SEO is a part of that conversation.
It's a
small part. Yeah. I always use the analogy that just as design can include photography, it's not synonymous with it.
Right.
Content strategy can include copywriting, and that may include SEO, hopefully, but it's not synonymous with it.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's a distribution channel more than anything. But it sounds like you work truly from the foundation, like laying the initial bricks when it comes to content. And I'm curious because I took a look at your website for Appropriate Inc. I'm assuming that's where you do most of your strategy work is through that. And it seemed like you worked with quite a wide variety of different organizations. And I noticed you using the word organization and not company. So I'm curious, and maybe they're synonymous in your head, but when I think of organization, I think of it's just a broader umbrella than just like a company trying to sell. So I'm curious, most of the clients you work with, are they attempting to sell? Are they attempting to educate? Like, explain to me kind of the type of clients that you work with and what kind of content you help them create, whether it's internal or external, or how they're attempting to connect with their audience.
So I use the term organization because I work with companies. I love working with really juicy, fun retail brands, but I also love working with higher ed institutions. Sometimes I feel like I'm really working with just like the marketing department within a company. So there I'm working with an organization and dealing with the culture of a team. And that's really like the big thing that we need to address. In some cases, I'm working with healthcare institutions or government entities or NGOs. And so I think because many of them think of themselves as organizations, that's the nomenclature that I've adopted as well.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I would say in those cases, I can look at it and say, they're all trying to sell something. I mean, sometimes it's a product with a price tag on it. Sometimes it's a new way of thinking or an idea that they want their audience to adopt. If it's a candidate that's running for office, they're selling something, but it's it's not something you can buy in any store. Higher ed institutions don't like to think of themselves in sales at all, but in many cases, they are selling education, selling the educational experience, or selling the opportunity to bring more of the kind of students that they like to produce into the world. So I might think of it as selling, but that's often not the language of my clients because they all kind of look at the world through different windows, and that's okay.
Yeah. And I admitted early on, like I'm coming into this conversation with just one perspective on content. And that is content marketing, SEO, SaaS, software businesses and the where content plays a role for those organizations. So I have quite a limited perspective on that, but I can appreciate how many different perspectives for all the organizations that you work with. And when I was in college, I actually worked for my university, and I never even thought about it as selling. But looking back at the things I did and the things I wrote for them, it definitely counted. So
yeah.
Cool.
I mean, same here. Like I had a few different work study jobs when I was a student. One of my favorites was being a tour guide for the admissions office.
I did that.
It was awesome. In part fun. Because like it seemed like a lot of the folks that gravitated to that role, to that job, were students in the drama department. And every now and again, I'll be like, oh, that person on TV. I remember leading tours with him. He always used to carry a water bottle and was super well hydrated.
That's so funny.
Yeah. But I mean, it's very much, we have that wonderful opportunity as communications professionals to help organizations re-envision how they see themselves and how they want their audiences to see themselves. Well, I misspoke. Both how they want their audiences to see them, and I think we have the opportunity to help their audiences see themselves in different ways that maybe, and I think this is probably where it bumps into content marketing. By engaging with your brand, by learning all I can before I make maybe a big ticket purchase, or decide to reach out to you for help or engage your services, by learning all I can, I'm going to feel that much more confident when I reach out to you or when one of your salespeople reaches out to me. And it's in that building that confidence that I can start to see myself maybe as better at my job, as able to make these decisions in a much better way. And I think that's a lot of the opportunity that people in professional communications right now can embrace, whatever kind of company you work in, whether you're selling software, whether you're selling durable medical goods, whether you're in a retail space, food service space. I think if you're in that mode of helping people self-educate and making it easier for them to move through content, you can nurture their confidence as well. And I think that's something that most audiences need now and that they can bring into other spaces.
Yeah, I really want to dig into that because I can feel it moving toward trustworthy and some of the questions I've pulled from there. But before we do, I'm curious, if we have a listener, or even just for myself, like you have someone that wants to get into content, or let's say they've been moving in a certain direction under the content umbrella and they want to change. I know we talked about how a lot of folks come in from journalism, communications, writing, marketing. We have a design background here, maybe psychology. What would you say to somebody who wants to work in content, work under that umbrella, be part of that, creating and maybe changing the narrative, building confidence in an audience? I don't even want to say a customer. I don't want to say a reader. Like it's bigger than that, a consumer, I guess. I don't know. What would you say to someone who wants to move in that direction career-wise?
Welcome. There is a lot of work to be done.
There is.
We need you. And I think people that have enthusiasm for this work and can couple it with enthusiasm for solving problems for people are in a really good place. I think that is the perfect mindset to bring to this work. I was having a conversation earlier today around content strategy and content design, and to a degree, content marketing in public health communications, and how we've seen over the past couple of years how so many efforts around public health, helping people help themselves, helping people stay safe in a pandemic. So many of those efforts either fail or succeed due to the quality of messaging around them, how well we're able to reach audiences with content that makes them feel secure and confident that they're getting it from the right places. And I think as more people become comfortable seeing problems in that kind of content, or comfortable seeing problems in other types of content as well, of identifying inconsistencies that maybe made you question the quality of a resource you were using, or you noticed gaps in customer service that made you just feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have used this company. Maybe I should be shopping elsewhere. I think as you start to notice those problems, it puts you in the right position then to be looking at how can you advocate for solving them. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're interested in content strategy, or maybe within another area of content or user experience design and want to move into it, I have to say that's what brought me into content strategy from design. I saw that it was an opportunity to ask bigger questions and address bigger problems earlier in kind of the typical project process. I mean, so much of having a seat at the table that we always talk about is getting there early enough that you can say, here's what I'm seeing. Here's how I think we might want to address it. What else is everyone seeing too?
So cultivating those unique perspectives, kind of pushing the envelope in places and not just going with the status quo, regardless of what component of content you're working on. So let's dig into Trustworthy, published in 2021. Amazing. I know that's not your first book, but I'd love to hear more about where that came from. There's a larger dialogue right now about just trusting each other, trust in authority figures, trust in data and information, and then trust in companies and where we spend our hard-earned money. So I'd love to hear what inspired that, and what that process was like.
I think two presidential election cycles ago.
Fair enough.
Let's hop into the Wayback Machine there. Yeah. When we go back to those times, specifically when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were kind of having at it, I was seeing some interesting things happen around political discourse and how people were reacting to it that I hadn't really noticed before. Specifically, that a candidate might be caught in a lie. And it used to be when that happened, it would scuttle their campaign. The press would be all over it, and we'd kind of kick them to the curb and say, okay, next. Mm-hmm. That was not happening. And I wondered, what does that do to an audience that's maybe hearing stuff and then not hearing any repercussions for things that they know are factually inaccurate? And what does that do to the candidates and more largely the brands that push inaccuracy, push misinformation? And I wondered, okay, how much does this matter then beyond kind of the world of politics? Because most of my clients are not in that space. As I mentioned, a lot are in retail or higher ed or software, hardware, or public health. And I wondered, okay, these problems, will they become problems for my clients as well? Because I was seeing how people were becoming more cynical, kind of turning away maybe from just checking in with their filter bubbles as they became aware of those filter bubbles, kind of turning inward, going with gut instincts. And I wondered, would that matter at all to my clients? It turns out it does. In pretty much every industry over the past few years, we've seen how as the people that we're trying to reach, the people that we're trying to maybe push toward a purchase decision or push to engage in a certain way with our brands, are taking a little bit longer. Sales cycles have slowed down. We've seen how people are kind of questioning the information that they're getting from companies that are ostensibly experts in the things that they sell. How people are pushing back against it. And I think anybody that is in the business of marketing should really worry about that and say, if we're losing their trust, what can we do? Yeah. And we can easily kind of point outside to say, well, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Different things have been happening with the economy that we haven't really seen before. A lot of other things are going on right now. But the fact remains that as our different audiences are becoming more cynical, as they are losing trust, we need to have a new way to respond to that cynicism. Mm-hmm. And that goes into rebuilding their confidence. So really, I was kind of noticing these issues 5-6 years ago. And then over the past several years, reaching out to other organizations that I found were doing it right, were earning the trust of their audiences, seeing what they were doing, seeing the common patterns among those organizations. That's what helped me realize the framework then that I present in Trustworthy, what organizations can do to rebuild trust in their audiences, both so as to help people have more confidence in their ability to self-educate, their ability to discern good sources of information, and then radiate that trust back on the brands that help them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to go back to kind of the why behind that phenomenon. We have so much at our fingertips, right? So you'd think that, well, high level, we would almost feel more trusting because we have so much available to us. Like, we have so many different pieces of data, sources, but I have to wonder if the noise is what makes us feel so distrusting. It's like the correlation feels off to me, and even myself. Sometimes if I'm even looking for a recommendation of a restaurant, I have 15,000 different websites I can visit, many different search queries, people I know who live around me, like influencers or social media people that I could go and see. And it's tiring, because you don't have the energy to not only parse through it, but then try to double check if you can trust that person, that website, whatever. So I'm curious what you think about, is it, maybe it's a chicken and egg issue. Is the distrust, did the distrust or the growth of that foster so much noise? Or do you think the noise is what led to that kind of feeling of, I don't know who to trust. I don't really know what to believe?
I think it's the latter. I think the noise, the increased amount of content,
information
causes
overload.
Yeah, it causes decision fatigue.
It is.
I mean, it used to be if you wanted to go out to a restaurant, maybe you would go on the recommendation of a friend that had recently been there, or maybe you'd check Yelp. Maybe in olden days you would check, I don't know, the Michelin guide or photos or something like that. In ye old times, going out to like ye old cafe. But now you're right. We've got like a million different recommendation engines. And we've learned that, well, some of those are gamed by the very places that are listed on there. So can we trust them? But I think you're speaking about a problem. Well, I don't want to call it a problem. I think you're speaking about a condition that has both features and benefits. We've democratized access to information. We've democratized publishing, which means anybody can get at more information now, and anybody can create more information now. And in that process, we've lost the gatekeepers of traditional publishing, whether it was an editor saying, here's what makes the cut, or somebody compiling information that says, well, here are our standards, and this is the review board that's giving it its seal of approval, so it has to meet these standards. We've taken away those people, those gatekeepers, and it hasn't all been bad. I mean, now anybody can be kind of that eyewitness to history and share their perspective on Twitter or Facebook.
Yep.
But I don't know that anybody can also be the arbiter of truth.
Right.
And I think as we've kind of turned away from experts, we need to ask, well, what do we do about that when people can get their hands on so much more content, but it isn't necessarily good content? How do the sort of arbiters of expertise continue to say, here's why our content is good, here's why we're trustworthy? And I think for a lot of brands in the content marketing space, it's tougher because now they're not just competing with the companies with which they compete. Now they're also competing with anybody with kind of a review site.
Right.
And some of those people are influencers, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe those are people that they can have on their side, but I don't know that we can necessarily take it like that. So I think the challenge then is to say, how do we earn trust? And it's through consistency in publishing. Mm-hmm. It's by offering kind of the right volume of information around exposing methods, exposing a roadmap, kind of showing our work and saying, here's what went into the content that we're producing now, so that, we're going to pull aside the curtain so you can see the process behind it as well.
Right.
And then sometimes I think also offering a degree of vulnerability around that content. I think for organizations to admit what they're learning, how they're improving their processes, how not everything goes perfectly to plan, and how that sometimes affects the product roadmap. That can be a really humanizing experience that brings more people to not critique the brand, but to champion the brand.
I want to go back a little bit to the democratization of everything, really, which is, there's a beauty in that. And I think that, the creator economy, really everybody having the ability to create a podcast, a movie, a song, there's been conversations about Spotify and all these things, like everything is available to us and it's empowering. But I also think it calls into question, like, the ability for us to trust ourselves, trust our decision-making process, trust our own taste, trust our own quality measure, trust ourselves to decide what's important to us when essentially someone else isn't doing that for us, which again, removing the gatekeeper, there is benefits. There's, disadvantages to that too, but it's forcing us to have to think harder. I think we could spin this off into a conversation about what that means for like mental health today, but I'd like to really double down on what you said earlier about teaching people how to self-educate. And I have two questions in that. Whose responsibility is that? And how can brands and organizations successfully do that? If it is their responsibility, or even partially.
So I would say, and not just because of who your audience is, but I would say if you're an organization, if you're a brand, if you're a marketer that is trying to retain your audience, maybe even build your audience right now, you should look at the opportunity to help them self-educate, to rebuild their confidence in that. You should look at that as your responsibility. Because if we lose the kind of the faith and interest and curiosity of our audiences, if they start kind of questioning everything that we're trying to put out there, we're just burning time and budget. And I think beyond just the interests of the organizations that we serve, we're also hurting society.
Yeah.
And I look at that as I don't want to say like kind of the greater call of marketing, but
I would agree with that.
I do think that this is one of those cases where marketing certainly won't save the world. Design won't save the world. Content won't save the world, but it will make it more worth saving. And if we can help our audiences remember how to navigate information, tap into the skills that they maybe used to have and maybe have forgotten around evaluating the quality of a resource, and nurture that confidence to not just take things on gospel because of who said it or who published it, but rather to take their beliefs and feel comfortable with testing them with opposing viewpoints, with gathering research from other high quality sources. I think if we can teach them that and kind of reignite that confidence, that's something that they can take into all other areas of their lives where they're making maybe more important decisions than they make on our websites. One of my favorite examples in Trustworthy, it was in talking with Crutchfield, the home electronics audio company, and they produce a tremendous amount of content, lots of different content types, really, really long pages with great SEO. And they can see, looking at their analytics, when somebody spends a lot of time on their site, when they're reading one of those really long pages, what happens when they get to the bottom of it, maybe comparing different products and looking at different product features. When they get to the bottom of those pages, they click to go to another page on the site and keep reading more. So people that come to them to learn, when they're finally ready to put a product into the shopping cart, they're not just buying the product, they're also buying a degree of confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody might come there saying, I don't really know a lot about, I don't know, digital SLR, single lens reflex cameras. I don't really know a whole lot about lenses and how to choose a body and whatnot. But by the time they do, they may not consider themselves an expert, but they can make that purchase with that much more confidence. And that knowledge and confidence is a feeling then that they can bring into other experiences to be able to make more concrete decisions, to be able to make good decisions and feel good about the decisions they make. And I think that if politicians aren't really helping us with that cause and the way we monitor political speech in the media, maybe they've kind of fallen off the responsibilities that they have as well. I think that next the marketers can step up, and people in professional communications and design and copywriting. We can look at how we build the confidence of our audiences.
That's fascinating. Yeah, we've been talking a lot within my little team about how content isn't necessarily responsible for telling people what to think, but how to think. And I think that kind of is the same kind of correlation with like self-educating and empowering folks through content. And I have to wonder if some folks are reluctant to do that, because I think it would then call out their own content from before, things that they've created in the past that don't necessarily follow this new framework. Or they kind of abuse this, how much our society is kind of like a sponge right now. And I know you said an aspect of building that trust with folks is vulnerability, and maybe calling out like things that aren't perfect in ways that organizations or leaders have messed up in the past. And, how does that play a role with brands who might want to shift their approach to this and be more of a part of the self-education movement and how they can empower folks through their content? What would you say to folks that maybe want to change their direction? How best do they go about that vulnerability?
Start. I think just start. And I mean, maybe your first forays into vulnerability and transparency can be saying, look, you've gotten to know our brand over the past 5, 10, 20 years. Here's how we've been doing business, but the economy is changing. Our society is changing. We want to be a part of a better way of doing business. So moving forward, we're going to be re-examining some of our old content, maybe retesting some of our old ideas, some of our old blog posts, different recommendations. We're going to be calling all that into account. Moving forward, we want to be more transparent. We want to embrace a better way of doing business, and we want to bring you into it. So we may not be doing everything right the first time, but we're going to prototype in public. We want our audience to be a part of this process of co-creation. If you're here, maybe it's because you're a fan of a product or a fan of our brand entirely. That's awesome. We want you to help us grow. And that's an approach that I have seen with companies that were coming under fire because maybe they screwed up in some way. Maybe their product didn't live up to expectations, or maybe the CEO did something incredibly boneheaded, or maybe they wanted to push more into embracing certain social issues that were important to the company, and they knew they were important to their target audience. And they said, we're not doing everything right yet around equity, around diversifying our workforce, around supporting women in leadership roles. We're not doing everything right yet, but we want to start getting it right. Here's what we're going to start doing, but open communication here. We'll be transparent with you. Be transparent with us too, with your feedback. And I've seen that approach from companies like, not to be meta about this since we're recording this on Zoom, but companies like Zoom that early on in the pandemic, when the product was not living up to expectations, when they were starting to see problems with security, problems with Zoom bombers, they paused, and the CEO published a kind of open blog post that said, "We've messed up. We haven't lived up to our own security goals. Here's what's happened." And he was very transparent. He said that, it used to be that we had 10 million daily business users. Now, within a few months, everybody suddenly working from home and all, schools using Zoom, we have 200 million daily users. Yeah, like huge growth there. But it was a lot of people that maybe didn't always have the guidance of an IT department that was there saying, maybe have a password for that meeting, maybe set a waiting room for that meeting. Right. Do you really want all the world joining your book club or your preschool classroom circle time? And he said, here's what we want to do though, moving forward. Immediately, we're going to be moving all of our security resources or all of our engineering resources to focus on security issues. We're also going to be submitting to a third-party transparency report. I'm going to be releasing weekly updates so you know what to expect and you know how our progress is going. And he lived up to that.
Right.
And it brought a lot more people to the brand to stop questioning the brand. One of the other organizations that I had the opportunity to interview in Writing Trustworthy was TED, when they were having content problems because their ideas worth knowing. Some people were realizing some of those ideas were scientifically spurious, maybe hadn't been fully peer reviewed. They had a few talks on their site that were wonderful and engaging and entertaining, but it turned out the science that they were espousing was either completely wrong, in which case the scientific community was sneering at it, or had become outdated, because that is the nature of science. We're always learning by testing and improving our ideas. And they kind of reached out to their harshest critics, many of the scientists that were scorning the organization and the brand, to say, okay, this is the problem as we see it. We hear you loud and clear. What can we do differently moving forward? And by convening their critics kind of in a co-design process, they heard, well, maybe we can keep this information on the site, but put it in greater context, link people out to more factually accurate talks or more updated versions or more updated thinking on the same topics. They added in some new content types to support that, updated a lot of their content to reflect it. And in the process, some of their most angry, upset critics some of their harshest critics became their most ardent champions. And I think that's how it can work in a publishing organization. I think any company that is engaged in marketing nowadays needs to think of themselves as the publishing organization and sees that kind of opportunity.
Yeah. Last question for you. And it's kind of the same question, but more for content creators. So anybody from freelance writers to, senior editors building content strategy for whatever their organization is, whatever they're selling. How would you say they could be a part of the self-education movement, empowering their readers to kind of know how to trust themselves and build that confidence?
I think the best thing that anyone in that sort of mode of professional communications can do right now is to look at how you can help your organization communicate in a more consistent way first. So that might mean saying, hey, let's kind of hit the brakes. We shouldn't be completely overhauling our website right now and completely overhauling our brand. Let's give our audience something that they know and that feels familiar to them. And I say that because when we're in a time of, as we say, unprecedented change in the pandemic, we don't need to introduce more change. Nobody needs to see a website refresh right now. So I think if you can be the voice for consistency, that's fabulous. And maybe that means at a lower level too, saying, why do we still produce all these content types like we're reinventing the wheel every time? What can we do to have maybe a more consistent, cohesive voice? Do we need to take a look at our editorial style guide? Do we maybe need an editorial style guide if we haven't had one in the past? Let's take a look at our editorial calendar to make sure that people always know what to expect, and create those tools if you don't have them. And those don't need to be big, complex things. Consistency is not a big, complex, sexy thing, but I think it's what our audiences crave right now.
Yeah. It's not always the most exciting, but it's definitely impactful.
Yes.
Well, thank you for joining me today. Before we sign off, I'd love for you to tell our audience, where they can find you if they want to learn more, how they can buy your book, where they can follow you, and all your ideas.
Sure. So you can find me online at appropriateinc.com, on Twitter at mbloomstein, and that's where I'm usually talking about issues around content strategy, some content design, dogs, mostly dogs, probably.
So the best content.
And and you can find Trustworthy at your favorite local bookseller. You can find it on Amazon and kind of everywhere in between.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed today.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.